Thank you for joining me on the Bold Lines podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about observing ego. This is one of my favorite things to consider and talk about in therapy. A little context before we start. This is going to be a two-part series. This initially started as a single episode, but after writing my script, I started to realize that if I were to cram it all into 20-ish minutes, it wouldn't do it justice. So if you like what you hear in this first episode, be sure to tune in next week to get the follow-up and full context. I will also say, let me know if this format is helpful for more in-depth topics. I can expand some of these things if everyone feels as if they could gain benefit from it. So observing ego, one of my favorite things in therapy. What is it? We use observing ego to understand why we think the way that we do and what it means to be empathetic. It is to gain the opportunity to see ourselves in a new light. Observing ego is most easily explained through the use of a floating eye. Keep this image of a floating eye in your mind, both throughout this episode and the next one. This floating eye gives us an ability to see perspectives, evaluate them, and make sense even if we don't agree. This eye feeds us information on what's happening. It helps us gain insight into sometimes deeper thoughts, ideas, or experiences. This floating eye, observing ego, is how we connect and see other people. It is the bedrock of empathy. If we cannot consider another point of view, we are not truly empathetic. We're only drawing on our own experience. This is something you'll hear me repeat throughout this episode and the next one. Observing ego, this way to see outside of ourselves, is how we look at other people's perspectives. Without it, we are rather egocentric. This is something that you might have heard before, and I'm pretty sure I've mentioned in a previous episode. Egocentrism, super easy to explain. Ego, meaning me. Centrism, well, that part makes sense. I'm in the center. With egocentrism, everything happens by me, for me, and because of me. This is very, very, very easy to see in children. Children are very egocentric. The world happens all around them. Their team won because they cheered. They lost because I wasn't watching. I tripped on the sidewalk, and it's the sidewalk's fault. We should all want to play what I want to play because it is the best idea. Hopefully, as kids grow up, they grow out of it. Sometimes they don't. And I do believe over the years, we've become more and more egocentric as a culture. But breaking out of egocentrism is done through social interaction with family and peers. It is done through this exploration and connecting with other people. I'm going to give a personal example, and then I'm going to link a section of a YouTube video to let you explore on your own what it looks like to be egocentric. I was in my car driving to daycare, and my child, holding a book, asked, "Daddy, what is this?" Now, I'm in the driver's seat. They are in the back seat. I cannot see what they are pointing at. Although, I kept getting asked what it was. This is a great example of egocentrism. I cannot see their point of view, but because they are seeing it, they assume that I can as well. This video that I'm going to link below, I think, encapsulates this very, very well. It's this interaction between a researcher and a child. And I'm not going to spoil it for you, but it shows just how much children see their own perspective and how they miss other people's perspective, even if it seems obvious to adults. So egocentrism is a failure of observing ego. When you cannot see outside of your own point of view, this floating eye is closed. Now, we're going to talk about all the different positions of this eye. That's for the next episode. But for what it's worth today, egocentrism has that eye closed. It doesn't truly evaluate what's going on, motivations, how things are happening. It simply assumes that whatever is happening is in the present. It simply assumes that whatever is happening in the present must be the truth. There are some people who naturally cannot engage in observing ego. I made a remark earlier that some people don't grow out of egocentrism very well. That's different than what I'm about to talk about. Those people can engage in observing ego with a little bit of work. It exists, they just don't do it well. Their eyes often closed or slightly cracked. They don't see the full picture. But there are two overall categories where it seems to me observing ego doesn't naturally occur. That is in personality disorders and autism. I've talked about personality disorders in a separate episode, and I can do that further in another one if it's of any interest. Personality disorders are a specific subsection of psychological diagnoses. It is not something that a person picks up one day. It is a pervasive interaction with other people and view of self that is clinically marked and studied. One of the episodes where I talked about personality disorders is not everyone is a narcissist. Narcissistic personality disorder is very real. Not everyone is one. Personality disorders do not have that floating eye. In my work with people with all kinds of personality disorders, they do not have this ability to view what anyone else might think. They have a hyperfixation on what's happening in the current moment. If they feel embarrassed, it's because everyone hates them. If they seem out of place, it's because the world is very, very wrong. Or if they need help and support to feel regulated, it's everyone's job to do that for them. Autism is the other category I spoke about. Now, when I'm talking about autism and observing ego, I'm not talking about someone who is autism adjacent. I don't take diagnoses of autism that are done at home or through home questionnaires. I'm sorry, that doesn't equate to the same thing. True autism does not allow the person to see outside of themselves naturally. What does that look like? Well, for people with autism, they do not seem to have this naturally occurring tendency to examine their own expectations or see what other people might be thinking or feeling. Their interest, the thing that is important to them, must be important to everyone else because they want to talk about it. Their feelings or emotions must be true of everyone else, so they can come off as cold or callous when really they just don't have the perception that everyone else has. Observing ego and understanding it well is incredibly important if you want to work with either one of these populations. Explaining observing ego to those with a personality disorder or with true autism and sometimes can feel like explaining a brand new color, one that it seems everyone else can understand, but they can't. Some people take that as a threat. Some people take that as an impossibility. A lack of observing ego does not necessarily identify a bad character trait, but it is something that is incredibly difficult to learn. Those without observing ego can be incredibly adept at doing very difficult or hard jobs. There was a story that I heard of someone who lacked observing ego, but was incredibly useful. They helped cut down corporate waste. They were brought in by companies to slash departments and people that simply didn't produce much of anything at all. In that way, they were incredibly useful, not only because they saved the company money, but because they kept it from going under, thus employing the people that were left and giving severance to those who left. So, I'm not saying those who lack observing ego contribute nothing or they're lesser. It's just something they lack. It might not be that those who are without observing ego are necessarily cruel, although some can be. Those without a naturally occurring observing ego do not genuinely believe that there is a perspective outside of their own. It's not that they discount other people's perspectives. It's that they genuinely cannot understand or guess what other people might be thinking or feeling. Personality disorders see suspicion as truth, and autism sees interest as truth. Both are focused on their own thinking. I will say in both of these cases, observing ego can be taught, although it's in somewhat of a synthetic way. You can see this in people with autism who are socially adept to some degree. They can understand that there are other perspectives and even learn to navigate them well enough, although, if they were honest, they would rather not work with them at all. And they're much more comfortable not having to engage in observing ego. The same is true with personality disorders. For those with genuine personality disorders, it's not that they are necessarily hateful. It's that they don't know that other people feel something. In some cases, they don't care. And in more extreme cases, they will take out their anger on the fact that others will have a different point of view. So those two overall diagnoses, personality disorders and autism, are examples where the I doesn't exist. Only a synthetic can be brought into place. But there are also those who have an observing ego, but the I is closed. They have the capacity to engage with others. They have a capacity for empathy, but it seems to be absent. There are two very obvious categories of people who have an I that is shut. Those with severe mental health issues and those in active addiction. It's almost as if their observing ego, their floating I, is held tightly shut in the midst of chaos or in a mental health episode. Heightened symptoms in mental health issues cause people to become egocentric. My thoughts are the whole truth. I believe everyone hates me, so it has to be the truth. In some ways, things like suicidality are incredibly selfish. Now, that might not be the nicest thing for someone to hear, but in the context of egocentrism, it is absolutely true. To be truly suicidal in the unhealthy, completely detrimental way, you have to consider that there's nothing else outside of this exact moment, that this exact moment will continue forever. And in that way, that eye is shut and you're missing information. Active addiction also keeps people from looking at what's really happening. While in mental health episodes, observing ego can fluctuate. When someone's in the middle of an episode, that eye is shut. And when they're stabilized on medication, it might be open. Sometimes it's because someone took medication. Sometimes we don't know why that happens. Active addiction is a little bit different. The observing ego of someone in active addiction keeps them from looking at what is really happening. They are also egocentric. They can also be called narcissistic. They can also be called out of touch or unempathetic. In reality, that eye closed leads them to the same egocentrism that we criticize in people with personality disorders or autism. Their cravings or fears are the most important. They give up physical safety for the grasp of an emotional one. Self-sacrifice isn't an option because there isn't any other truth than what they are currently experiencing. Active addiction is a great example of that I being present but held tightly shut. When working with clients and an overall recommendation, I don't think it's a good idea to argue observing ego in the middle of a mental health episode or active addiction. I can't ask someone to look at themselves, to examine a situation, if their eyes are closed. It's like presenting information when someone is asleep. While others might consider that all this information might be helpful, if someone's in the middle of a mental health episode or an active addiction, the problem is you can present all of this information. Their floating eye will just assume it's not real. Their eyes are closed. They're missing it. They just might not know that they're missing it. Instead of trying to shake someone with their eyes closed or getting them to look at their decisions, I look for moments of lucidity. When someone is sober and on the medication that they need to be sober and emotionally present is when we can actually engage in their observing ego, their floating eye. That's when change can happen. With a substance or episode in the way, no real change can happen. It's just contingency management. To give you an explanation of what this is like for someone who has never experienced either a significant mental health episode or active addiction, Imagine that you are sleeping. You are in a dead sleep. A hurricane could be outside and it wouldn't wake you. Then all of a sudden, the lights are flashed on. You're woken up suddenly and someone places a flashlight directly in your eyes. You may want to close your eyes again or go back to sleep. In many ways, this is the exact same thing that happens when people in mental health episodes are stable and when addicts are sober. Their observing ego has been so used to the darkness that it's adjusted. And when all the lights come on, it's overwhelming. All of the world around them that seemed to not exist immediately comes into focus. It becomes overwhelming. These moments of lucidity are the same thing as that flashlight popping up in an eye in the middle of the night, drastically waking someone up. Outside of that mental health episode, when people are forced to look at all the damage around them, they would rather go back to sleep, or they might not be able to let their eyes readjust to the light and waking up. And so they will find ways to either enforce their eyes to close or shut the lights off again. Recovery from both of these things is an exercise in letting your eyes adjust. It's using observing ego to slowly engage in the world around you, to take other people's perspectives, engage in empathy. Interestingly enough, a lack of observing ego is a signal for many family members and loved ones to know if someone has relapsed in addiction or if they're experiencing mental health issues. If someone who is continually sober and empathetic all of a sudden starts to become synthetic or present a facade or seems to assume relationship dynamics that don't exist, this is a signal for a lot of family members and loved ones to know that they've relapsed or are on the short course of doing so. What does this have to do with therapy? Many therapists will assume that they can help a client, that if they just present them the information and if that client can repeat it back to them, then true change can happen. But imagine I was trying to give a presentation to someone with their eyes closed. I could give the best case for what is going on with them and how to fix it. But if they are unable, cannot, or do not have the eyes to do so, all of my work doesn't get me anywhere and it doesn't help them at all. Instead, it frustrates them. And good work, good feedback can seem to go to waste. In therapy, a lot of the beginning work for a lot of clients is simply opening their eyes and letting them adjust. It's something that I wish a lot of providers started thinking more about in treatment centers and facilities. I think a lot of places do really try to do this, to see the family impact, to examine the way that everything has affected them. Unfortunately, though, things have swung in an unhealthy direction. For a lot of mental health and addiction facilities, families are told to admit that things are harmful, but not really address the harm that they've felt because it could be overwhelming. That's for later. Unfortunately, without forcing someone's eyes open, they cannot healthily engage in the world around them and, in my opinion, be truly sober and in recovery. So should we hate on people in order for them to open their eyes? To some degree, if we want to be crass, sure. People need to open their eyes if they want to engage in the world around them. For those family members and loved ones who are connected to addicts or those in a severe mental health episode, their eyes might also be shut or slightly cracked. They might also struggle to see the large picture, and they might be so enveloped in the moment that they hand money to someone they know is going to use drugs, or they will enable behavior that is completely harmful and they know will ultimately kill them. So everyone involved needs a wake-up call. Everyone involved needs to have the lights turned on. Maybe for those who didn't want to wake up, for those who don't want their eyes to adjust, we can suggest something incredibly therapeutic and definitely recommended: a bucket of cold ice water. We're going to be continuing this topic next week. This floating eye, this observing ego. We've got an idea of what it is, how it applies, who does it well, who doesn't, and where it naturally occurs and changes. But we're going to continue into more practical applications. What does it look like for this floating eye to give us information? What kind of information can it give us? Again, this is one of my favorite topics of therapy. It's something that most clients don't get in initial sessions. It takes a little bit of time, but it's something that I think can help anyone, even outside of therapy. This practical application will absolutely benefit anyone listening. Taking the time to understand what we see and what we might miss can help us become more empathetic and engaged. So I hope you tune in next week. Thank you for listening today. I hope all of this was useful. If you feel so inclined, I hope you follow this podcast and share it with those who might find usefulness in it. Be sure to tune in next week. We're going to talk about what all of this observing ego stuff really means in our own lives. Thank you for listening today. Keep walking towards healing and helping those around you.